call it the committee formerly known as Technology, Media, and Telecommunications. And we decided, I think, Daniel, was it sometime end of last year, to disrupt ourselves and become something new. And one of the reasons we did it is we thought, I think the name of the committee was probably founded about 10 years ago or longer, and at the time, the focus on technology, media, and telecommunications made sense. And we felt like we had run its gamut, and our last two events moved more towards HR and educational impacts of technology, and we decided that it made more sense for us to broaden our remit a bit and give us a bit Spielraum, as you'd say in Luxembourgish, for the topics that we want to cover. And you'll see that tonight in the diversity of the panelists. So we have this really clever name, Shakespearean disrupt or be disrupted. That is the question, and it is a question because in most of industries and businesses, education, pretty much everywhere nowadays, disruption is a hot topic. Everybody attaches their own definition to disruption. And so I put a couple definitions from 3 different sources on the screen to see if we even have a common definition of what disruption actually is. So the first 2 are from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. First is called to break apart. So that makes sense. To throw into disorder. And I think that goes more in the classic direction that most of us would understand a disruption to be. I think when I was growing up, disruption was some kind of weapon from a Star Trek episode. So everybody can look at it a different way. Now, the third one is from the Cambridge English Dictionary, a bit more elaborate. An interruption in the usual way that a system, process, or event works. And heading towards a more business definition of disruption. And last but not least, this comes from a professor at Harvard Business School. Displacing an existing market, industry, or technology and produces something new, more efficient, and worthwhile. And I think that last definition will lead into our panelists right now because that's more of a sense of how businesses are dealing with disruption. So for our 4 panelists tonight, first I'd like to introduce, I got my notes out here, Veronique Hoffeld, who is a partner at Loyens & Loeff in Luxembourg. Veronique studied in Aix-en-Provence, Paris, and London. Afterwards, she was a partner at Bond, Schmidt & Steichen in Luxembourg, and is now a partner and a member of the management committee at Loyens & Loeff. To her right is Roman Hoffman, who studied in Nancy and also in the USA, Miami University, Oxford, Ohio, not Oxford, England. After his studies, he became logistics manager at Guardian LuxGuard, followed by a general manager at BP in Luxembourg. He liked it so much he came back later on. Then he became production personnel and quality manager at Guardian, followed by managing director at BP. And in his infinite free time, he's also president of the Groupement Pétrolier Luxembourgeois. To his right, probably our image of disruption, Mark Molitor. He studied in Zurich and then at INSEAD, and since then has become a serial disruptor in a lot of ways. He worked at in several positions at units from Johnson & Johnson, so from marketing to business unit director to general manager. Afterwards, he was MD at the Greenhouse, also CEO at Monitor IT, non-executive director at My Science Work, MD at Capital for IP, general manager at Patent Portfolio, and we're going to finish at some point, and now chairman and co-founder of Doctana, which I think a lot of us know here in Luxembourg, which has been a fantastic success from the Luxembourg market. Last but not least, Paul Peckles also studied in Switzerland, also studied at INSEAD, because that's what engineers do. He started his career at DuPont in Luxembourg, followed by a stint in banking, where we first met in risk management. After that, he became director of PTT. Before it was Post, or
yes,
after?
I was Entreprise des Postes et Télécommunications.
Okay, that's a long one. I think Post is a lot better for most of us. And now he's CEO at St. Paul, Luxembourg, obviously Luxembourger Vort and Lux Times and others. And Paul is the link between our former group and our current group. And I was in Chicago. Anybody ever been to Chicago? Anybody ever do the architectural river cruise? So I learned this in August, that the buildings in Chicago, because there's so many of them, they always pay homage to their neighbor. So there's some element in each building which references its neighbor, either across or next door. So Paul is like our architectural reference to our previous committee because he also spoke at our last event on the TMT last year.
Okay. Well, I apologize for the picture because, yes.
Well, that's LinkedIn for you. So, in classic panel discussion format, we have questions obviously for each of the panelists, but we like you guys to interrupt whenever you have something that you want to address to either to the entire panel or to an individual panelist. Please do it as we go. I'm just going to ask one question to the audience first. When you think of a product or a company that disrupted or is a disruptor, what do you think of? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Apple. Skype. Uber. Tesla. Tesla. Oh, wait. This is hard to write in my lap. Tesla. Spotify. Any others? Metro Bank. Microsoft. Amazon. Facebook. Okay. We'll stop at that. I might refer back to those later on. So this is going to be a softball question, which everybody can fill in as they like. So I'm going to start with Veronique on this one. Are you disrupting? Are you being disrupted? And tell us how, in which ways. Okay. And you can also, as a lawyer, mention that for your clients.
Yeah. Oh, well, I represent, I think, tonight here the legal sector, and I think the legal sector is a very conservative sector. So there are not many disruptors in our area. But still, I mean, there is disruption, we know that, and we are maybe not front runners, but we invested early on. For instance, we created a legal lab. What is a legal lab? We have an IT, well, we are an international law firm. We are in different financial sectors. Our home markets are above all the Benelux, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and also Switzerland. And then we have representative offices all over the world: New York, London, Paris, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, etc. And we have our IT people. They sit in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and there are 40 people, and they are just IT. So they are actually responsible for the functioning of our IT systems, and we tried to put together our IT people with our young lawyers, because old lawyers tend not to be so creative. So we said, okay, you young lawyers, if you have an idea, you try to get it across to the IT people, you can create apps, etc. So we did that like a couple of years ago already, we started that. And it was a big success. However, the problem is if you say, yeah, just do something, then obviously if you don't have a project planning, etc., it gets a bit into all directions. And now we try to do something more structured, but we didn't give up. We had also certain very nice ideas. At the same time, we developed systems for automatic contract drafting. That's something that's very known in the legal sector, because actually in certain, like in the banking sector, corporate, there are a lot of standard documents. So you can actually, if you have a legal, what we call legal engineer, that means a lawyer that takes programming lessons, becomes a programmer, can program systems. For instance, you want to draft a share purchase agreement. So the system will, you will give to your young lawyer a questionnaire. What do you want? And he will fill in the questionnaire, and afterwards the machine, the computer, will draft you a first draft. And then afterwards it has to be reviewed, obviously, etc. But that's what a lot of law firms try to do now in the legal sector, train lawyers to become programmers, to program systems, to draft certain types of contracts like share purchase agreements, shareholders agreements, etc. Obviously, you always need a lawyer, so the lawyer has to review it, to adapt it, but you have at least the first draft, and very quickly. Where you also have these kind of developments is in due diligence. What is a due diligence? For instance, if you have a merger and acquisition, you have law firms that do the audit, the legal audit of the target. And so in the old days, you put just 15 lawyers into a room with 2 million of documents, and they had to review all the documents and come up with a report. Nowadays, you can have computers that scan the documents, and you, for instance, you search for a certain, like, change of control clause. The computer spits it out in 3 minutes and says, in these documents, you have a change of control clause. And then afterwards, you have already a first selection of the documents, so you don't have to go through the millions of documents. So that's something that is also developed. But most of these computer programs concern only English documents, and most of this is developed in London and in the Anglo-Saxon countries. So in Luxembourg, for instance, for us, it's difficult to use it because we have documents in French and in German and in English. So we have to create our own systems because we can use part of it, but not all of it. These are certain ideas that we develop. We have also this year launched, or like last week, launched a Tech Academy. What is this? That's an e-learning system for our young lawyers that are interested in blockchain, artificial intelligence, etc. They get like a training at their desk. And the training is actually an e-learning module. And that's how we try to keep up the pace. I think we are in the trend. We are not front runners. We invested early on, but we were always quite prudent. But we are in the trend, and I don't think we are disrupted at this point in time. We are not maybe the disruptors either, but we are in the trend. So that, yeah.
Roman, in the energy sector, which way is it going?
Yeah.
Say energy instead of petrol or gasoline. Broaden the horizon.
Yeah, I think it's. I think energy is the blood stream of all our economy. So it's at the heart of everything we do. So for the last decades, even centuries, it has been a tremendous accelerator of human progression. But it has seen also a lot of changes, undergone a lot of changes, and that I think is not going to stop. I think it's getting even more unpredictable these days, where the trend is heading to. I'm working now for 25 years in the sector here in Luxembourg. So just to give you an idea, in Luxembourg we are only doing retail sites. So we have the Aral brand, which belongs to BP as well. So we are the market leader here in retail sites. So that's, but I'm also part of the European leadership team, as we have a head of country for each country. So I get a lot of the bigger picture of BP also with it. But as I said, when starting in the 90s, today we should not have any petrol left anymore to explore, because it was the end of the energy that was predicted. And then in 2000, roughly, I mean, you could, or 1908, $1 a barrel of petrol costs less than $8, so we were also at that time doomed. That's old industry. Also then came with fuel cell for the transport sector. Now it was the media talked a lot about the fuel cell and hydrogen as a fuel for mobility. And by now we should all run on that, so that did not come through. So it's really unknown yet where our sector will go to. I think we have, as our company always say, the double challenge to meet. There's a growing need for energy in the world with the growing population, with our growing needs also for energy. And I think we talk about internet, about smartphones. I mean, these are tremendous eaters or needers for energy, technology. I think at the group level, especially for exploration. I mean, those projects where oil or natural gas is taken out of the ground, these are huge investment projects that are sanctioned at minimum 5 years or 10 years before they even operate. So and you invest a lot of billions of dollars or euros, whatever currency you take. So you have to take a bet on what's happening in 10 years if that energy is still needed. And there, of course, the technology is being used quite a lot now of these days. So I think BP, for example, has one of the biggest supercomputers in the world in their exploration center in Aberdeen. just to really look at what's happening underground. It's often kilometers underground, and to see how we can extract the last molecule of oil or gas. There one needs to say, I mean, 10 years ago, typically an oil field was closed when only 30% of the oil was recovered, because then the technology was not there to recover more. And that now with new technologies, of course, is this barrier is taken further up as the way goes. So
It's not only, sorry, use this microphone.
So it's not only the search for new sources, but going back to old fields where you can get more out of them.
yeah. But then the second part of the challenge is, of course, climate change and keeping our emissions so that the Earth is not warming up by, one say, maximum 1.5 degrees, but we are not currently on that trajectory. But also our companies do a lot of investment in those areas, trying to reduce the emissions out of our activities, so to be able, though, to supply the energy that's needed by the growing population. So it's then on, if we look at mobility, of course, electromobility is now, there we are, a lot of disruption, I would call it, almost by regulatory, by laws, which makes it difficult that even in Europe, it's not one direction Europe goes, but each country is going a different angle. And so for a small country like ours, if I come back to retail size, it becomes more and more difficult even to get the product produced somewhere in Europe that's conform now to the Luxembourg legislation. So this is also in that aspect, we need to be very creative and also always attentive, take into account new technologies to cope with all these uncertainties.
Okay, thank you. Mark, Doctana, you can talk about your previous experience as well, but is it really a disruptor? Are you disrupting assistants in doctors' offices, or tell us a bit more about it?
I mean, you mentioned that we're disrupting. I mean, what are we disrupting? Question to the audience. Complacency. There you have to elaborate on that.
Always evolves, and if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and not adapt to the changes, well, you're going to be left behind. So
Yeah.
you have to sort of disrupt it, sort of, you can argue to, what's the word? Well, you've got to set an example, right?
I mean, does everybody know what we are doing, or shall I just briefly explain what we're doing? Please explain. So, you know, if I would be a bold young 23-year-old, I was like, we're disrupting healthcare, which is of course total bullshit. We're just solving a very simple problem, a pain point. You know, when you think about creating a company or startup, try to solve a problem. The problem that we're solving is when you are calling to book a doctor's appointment today, the majority of you will pick up the phone, dial number, and then be for 15 minutes in the waiting line. Beep. So,
41 last time.
you know, and I think when you then book a flight, which was kind of like disruptive 15 years ago, today you take out your mobile phone, you book it. You book in your tickets at the Philharmonie on your mobile phone, you do anything on your mobile phone. But there are certain things where you still kind of like have to pick up the phone and call somebody. So going back, the problem that we're solving, or that's the pain point for you as a patient. Now, as you believe that the assistants who are sitting in the doctor's office, you know, do you think that they love picking up the phone from at Monday morning, 9 o'clock? I mean, I invite you to go to a doctor's office on the Monday at 9 o'clock. You know, I mean, some of them are really proud because they show you that, look, there is 8 lines in parallel currently open, you know. So this is just amazing. And our solution is that we help to bring a certain efficiency. I think I very much like I think it was Christensen's definition. There is a process, you know, where we just take technology which existing somewhere else, and we bring it to another use case. And that is a very simple use case. And I think when we then ask so just booking an appointment online, the same way that you book your hotel, the same way that you book your flight, that's kind of what you do. Now, are we disrupting? Are we disrupting healthcare? Hell no. We may talk again in 15, 20 years, and then the thing will have changed, because I strongly believe that we are onto something which is bigger than just kind of like, solving just a small problem, because today we have in Luxembourg a quarter, so we are today in 6 countries. Luxembourg is the country where we launched 5 years ago. We have 25% of all of the doctors who are already using the platform, so which is, some would say, well, that's only 25%, but it's probably one of the highest penetrations across Europe and the world. We have probably the similar size of people who have been using it in terms of penetration, which is also 20%. I mean, the number of mobile phones and emails that we have and the usage, I think we're much more used than the Agence E-Santé, who are then struggling to put in this dossier médical partagé. And today it's just this appointment booking, but there will be additional services that we are planning to introduce, because, and this is not going to be, people are talking about video consultations. Yes, you will be able to do video consultations in the future. Now, it's not going to be next year, it's not going to be the year thereafter, but eventually that is where the technology will go. Our first priority at the moment is when we ask the patients, what do you want? Do you want to have video consultations? Do you want to have renew your prescription? Do you want to have your medical record on your mobile phone? Lots of fancy things where you have plenty of startups who are disrupting healthcare. That's not what the patients want. They just say, like, can I just please have this great Doctena product to book all of my doctors and not just the 25%? So that's kind of like what we're working on, so stay tuned. And as I said, we are in Luxembourg, we're in 6 other countries, and we have still, the next objective is that we get to 25% penetration in Germany, which is a little bit more than the 650 doctors that we have in Luxembourg, so we still have some work to do there.
Well, can I ask, how do you get paid?
How do we get paid? Well, if I listen to the German doctors who are not signing up with us, it's like, you're probably selling the data to somebody, which is, of course, total BS, again. Our business model is quite simple. When we ask the doctors, people believe it's about getting new patients, getting new traffic, and making money. No. The main reasons why doctors are working with us is that it's efficiency. It's efficiency because if you look at the time that you can save on the process, which is probably one of the most stupid processes that exists. And when you ask those assistants, they will say, well, are you having fun doing that? No. They're stressed. And I challenge you, next time that you call a doctor, any doctor in any specialty, in any country, you get asked the same 5 questions. What's your name? What's your birth date? Have you been here before? And why do you want to come? In Germany, they also ask you, like, are you privately insured or public insured? But based on these 4 questions, you get an appointment in 2 days, in 4 weeks, or in 6 months. And that's intelligence, we put into a software, because there's much more software and intelligence than you see from the app. And then we try to take this technology to make it work smoothly. And so an average doctor, he can gain several hours of productive time where his assistant can be nice to the people who are coming into the practice or can assist the doctor, et cetera, and really use the time for added value stuff. Now, of course, the assistants, they believe that, some of them who are, it's like, oh, but if the doctor is now using that, I won't have any job. So they're boycotting us, which means that the doctor says, I want to have you use Doctena, and then the assistant says, no, it doesn't work, Doctena doesn't work. And then, we get a cancellation again, and then we know, okay, it's going to take some time. It's very conservative, it's a very long process, but eventually we will have 100% of the doctors where you can book online. And Luxembourg is going to be one of the first countries where we achieve that.
So actually it's true, then the receptionists are worried that you're going to disrupt them.
Some of them, are, of course. But nobody likes change. And the biggest challenge, in terms of disruption, in getting to 25% penetration in 5 years, is that a lot? Is that not a lot? Probably if I look at my business plan that I submitted 5 years ago, we probably had estimated it would be much further. It is because the people don't like to change. It's this kind of like, but you have to take them along that say like, well, this is how you can use it. It's not just the software, because it's really about educating also the people to use it differently. Because when we tell the doctors, like, if you really want to benefit of this efficiency, you have to tell your patients. And some of them, they are doing it greatly. I mean, the other day, a friend of mine came up to me, he's like, I had this great personal relationship with my doctor, I would send her an SMS, and she would then, to get an appointment. And last time, when I said, like, when can I come? She just replied, well, book an appointment on Doctena, period.
I have to thank you. You saved my American Thanksgiving 3 years ago. I somehow managed to accidentally, late night on a Friday night, lose a tooth in an accident. I had 12 people coming for dinner on Saturday night. I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Doctena, dentists available on Saturdays. And I found one that was available until noon on Saturday morning. Got there, got a temporary replacement, and managed to eat turkey because of Doctena. Well, thank you in retrospect.
You're welcome.
It's a true story.
And I think it's a good example, because the part of the disruption, on the broader scale, is that you make visible what is not visible. The same way that Uber is showing, like, oh, all those cars are now available. The same way that if you go at home, it's like, oh, these are all the places which are up for sale. The apartments, it's just making something visible which before was not visible. And I think that is kind of like probably one of the biggest disruptions in that way that we're doing.
Okay. Paul, I think most of us think of media, and I used to work for Reuters too, as the ultimate victim of disruption. So, and you guys are fighting back.
I don't agree with that, let's say, situation, or with your characterization. I would argue that you have to distinguish between a number of things in the media industry. The only real disruption, and then even there, I would argue that we cannot even discuss about disruption, but it's more of a very fast evolution, is the business model for media. In the past, you had the advertising revenue, you had the subscription revenue, and that was it, and you had a good living. In the meantime, you have the diversification for advertisers is getting faster and faster. You have the Apples, the Googles, and the Facebooks of this world eating up your advertising revenue. And so you have to reinvent your business model. And that's now really only the business model. I would then argue on the main purpose of our business, journalism and publishing. There's still a lot of need for that service for all the democracies of this world. And so there I don't see a disruption. I think that these services for the general public are as important as ever and will continue to be so. There is a disruption in the sense, there's an evolution in the sense that there are new players in this market. Any blogger or vlogger or whatever can be a media producer nowadays with very little or basically no invest. But the old school media companies have a lot of credibility, have a lot of brand power, and therefore that service, that journalistic service to the general public is very important. And I don't think there's a real disruption there. And the third point is on the technology side, where I would even argue that the media companies were always very innovative and created new technologies and used new technologies even before they were used by other people or other companies or other sectors. my company introduced the first internet news site here in Luxembourg more than 20 years ago. So that was at the forefront, I would say, of the digital revolution. And nowadays it's basically ridiculous when you think that the whole process in a media company is completely digital. Everything is in the digital world. But just at the end of the day, we take everything out of that digital world and we put it on a piece of paper just to satisfy our customers who want to read a printed newspaper. But for the rest, everything is on the digital in the digital world, digital platforms. So I would distinguish between these three areas and then argue that it's not a real disruption in most of these areas, but specifically in the business case area, that's where the biggest problems are so far for the media industry.
I tend to agree on the other 2 points, but if the business model isn't right, then the rest of it kind of collapses. That's the problem.
Yes.
Or not.
And that's why I started with the business, with the business case and the business model, of course. But there are many ideas in the industry on how to overcome these problems and how to reinvent the media industry. Again, always, in many cases, based on the fact that journalism and publishing is very important and still has its value in our world.
This is your lucky day. You get the second question as well, so you get to keep talking. So this leads into the second question, though. And you mentioned some names in there, I think Apple and others. Disruption in the industry, you mentioned business model specifically. And you mentioned vloggers and bloggers and everything else. So whatever disruption that you perceive, is it coming from what you would say inside of the media industry or outside of the media industry? And do you see where it's coming from now or not? Or is there something around the corner that you're trying to imagine is going to come next?
I'm not sure. You had these questions sent in advance, so I had some time to think about this, but I couldn't come up with a good answer to that question. I'm very sorry.
No problem.
It depends. Some of these evolutions are clearly visible, and it's like the old school newspapers facing at one point of time radio and TV. So I would compare it to that situation. Now today the evolution is faster than at that time, but it's quite a similar situation. So there is evolution within the industry, and you see today with media companies inventing and reinventing and innovating every day with new ideas, new products, and so on. I think New York Times has a team of 200 plus people just working on new products, and they issue new products every second month, and then they scrap them again and they reinvent and so on. So it's a very dynamic industry, and with a lot of innovation coming from the industry. But then you have the outside world of the media, and that's where then other players come into the game, like the IT people. Microsoft was mentioned before, but Microsoft nowadays doesn't make really any software. They sell completely different products and different services. And in that evolution, you see a lot of non-media companies becoming media companies because they see also the value of that content. And then I'm back to the journalistic content I mentioned before. They see the value of that, and they want to build also their business model, including the journalistic content.
I think somebody mentioned Amazon as well, and Spotify. Another one I would put on here is Netflix. The evolution of those companies from distributors to realizing that the true value is in the content. They have to create the content.
Well, Amazon is a perfect example. There's a gentleman called Bezos, if I'm well informed, and he got a playground called Washington Post. People have a lot of money, so they can have bigger playgrounds than small children. And so he's now working on the technology side of the media industry by providing a similar platform as he did with Amazon for all the publishers. So nowadays I don't have to buy any computers or servers anymore as a media company. I can rent everything with the Washington Post, and basically it's a service provided by Amazon or another spin-off.
It's like AWS?
No, it's even another spin-off. I can't recall the name now. Okay. So they are providing that service. It's software. It's all in the cloud. You don't have to. You can set up your own media company now within a very short period of time. And traditional media companies like ourselves, we are analyzing switching to these platforms to make our life easier and to take advantage of that technology disruption I mentioned before when we first introduced websites and introduced digital print processes and so on.
Can I ask you about Lux Times? That's innovation this year. And I saw recently there was actually a print magazine that was published.
Yeah.
Started as the digital delivery last mile, and then went back to a printed edition as well.
We don't see it that way. No, Luxembourg Times is the digital product. It's based on the rented platform, so similar to what I just described with what the Washington Post is providing, but on a smaller scale. We couldn't afford the big thing. So it's foreseen to stay on as a digital product. We want that digital platform, and also it's for us very important to reach the very diverse readership we have in Luxembourg and in the bigger region. The magazine is, if I may, nobody is really listening. It's more a marketing tool to make it more visible, also on paper.
So Mark, I'm going to throw the next question your way. Long career in healthcare. When you're identifying opportunities, how do you identify them? And what criteria do you use to determine whether they're worth pursuing or not? Because you mentioned before you're solving a problem, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good business opportunity. So what criteria do you apply in terms of looking at which problem it makes sense to solve?
As you mentioned, I spent 10 years with Johnson & Johnson, so this is a big American AAA-rated company, different functions, traveling throughout Europe. But then you kind of like realize, like, this can't be it. You know, do you really want to make one of the biggest companies even richer? Or do you want to do something a little bit more meaningful? And when I left J&J, I think it was to get back some quality of life in terms of, I was 2 years away from becoming senator for life on the frequent flyer program. When you wake up in the morning and you don't know which city you're in, you're like, it's maybe time to do something different. And that coupled then kind of like with the career element. And I think for me it was clearly the future is digital. Healthcare is going to be digital. So by pure coincidence, I joined a spin-off, which was, you mentioned it earlier on, I already had forgotten it, Monitor It, which was the first spin-off of a public research institute here in Luxembourg. Company doesn't exist anymore. It was a great learning experience. It was in telemedicine. Telemedicine was like the future in 2010. It's still the future today, and will still be the future in 10 years, and it will not have moved any inch because healthcare is extremely, extremely complex. From there, I moved on into Greenhouse, which was like an incubator, looking at projects, being an angel investor, until we came up with Doctena, and I think that's where kind of like it made click. I mean, I was story behind Doctena in 2 words. A good friend of mine is Patrick Hairston. He was supposed to be here today. And he's the co-founder of Monster, of a job portal, which was sort of Monster, and then the real estate platform At Home. And when I was coming back to Luxembourg, we were having lunch on a regular basis, and I said, let's do something together. And I said, look, my area is healthcare, and his area is like internet, and I said, digital healthcare, that's what we want to do. So we looked at different areas that we could create something, until one day we stumbled upon on a platform called ZocDoc. Now, ZocDoc is basically Doctena in the US. In terms of it, I'm not telling that I kind of like woke up one morning and I was like on my teeth. I was like, oh, would this be a great solution? No, I mean, it was clearly like somebody else was disrupting another area. Can we apply this to Europe? Yes, maybe. And then Patrick's reaction at the time was, well, I know how to build such a business. I've done it twice. I said, what do you mean? Well, and then we kind of like went through the kind of like entire similarities, showing what is visible, the distribution model, how you get the content, which is basically the appointments. And next day I said, let's move. And we got a third co-founder, which was Anna Fontaine, who's the IT guy behind At Home. And that was how we started off Doctena. So it was. But it started off that we clearly saw, that's a problem that we want to solve. And we launched in Luxembourg. That was for us the proof of concept, rather than going to, you had some teams in Paris, some teams in Berlin. When we got to the first patient survey, which was done in 4 months after the launch, we had like within a day, 300 people who responded. And we did not even kind of like give a free iPad away or this kind of stuff. And
we don't do that either.
And we had 96% said that this platform is easy to use, or very easy to use. And we had 97% of the people who said we would recommend it to our friends and family. And if you work with a number of other companies and startups, like, this is a pretty damn high figure. And then it's like, we are onto something here. And I think from there, so we said, okay, we're not going to stay in Luxembourg. We're also going to go into other markets where it's new. Today, we are very advanced in Luxembourg, but in Germany we have 5,000 doctors, so probably 10 times more than we have in Luxembourg. But it's still a much bigger country, and we haven't reached the tipping point that we have here. That is because in healthcare everything is taking a long period of time. But in terms of how you select, I mean, I had also other activities because I was not working full time from Doctena. I mean, it was more Patrick's as a CEO, so I'm more the chairman. I was like the sparring partner, and then in the beginning we were discussing once a week, then once a day, and then suddenly I was working for Doctena 1 day a week, then 2 days a week, then 3 days a week, and you realize that you can really move a needle. So it's an iterative process where at some point it's like, well, this is what we're going to focus on.
Okay. Romain, back to you. And you mentioned some of this at the beginning too, regulation. And I want to ask you, especially in the energy industry, gas stations were going to disappear. They were going to disappear. There was no more oil. Kind of what you said. It's the future is grim every day, and it will still be grim in 50 years. But having said that, climate change is real, despite some people from my country who apparently don't think so. There's technological changes, as you mentioned, whether it's the ability to produce wind energy and actually distribute it and store it. You mentioned regulatory environment, which is big. Suppose that the European Union isn't very unified in their regulatory approach. You have tax incentives to buy electric cars, maybe, that are established by governments. So where is all this disruption going? Where do you see the biggest potential disruption, and how are you attacking it? Is there a goal at BP to say, okay, we're 98% of our revenue is in petroleum now, we want to get to a point where it's 80% and build alternative energy sources, or how are you looking at it? Are you going to disrupt yourselves, or is the government going to do it to you, or the environment going to do it, or?
Good question.
Sorry,
I don't have the real answer. But I think coming back to that, I said 25 years in the industry, and I think BP was already back in 2000. Then was the Kyoto Protocol that had been ratified. And BP, we had a very visionary CEO at that time, Lord Brown. That time it was BP stood for Beyond Petroleum even. So I think we were at that time at the forefront of alternative energies. We were, I think at beginning 2000, we were the biggest solar panel producer. We had the best technology at that time. We were investing in wind, we were investing in biofuels, so big time. And for the solar industry, for example, I can still remember that we had production facilities in Spain, in California, and somewhere in the east, I think, Indonesia. And it was at the European meeting where we, the group, announced that we would double the production capacity in Spain. And 5 months later, I think the investment was stopped. A year later, the plant in Spain was closed because we had been disrupted by the Chinese. So the Chinese were coming up. There was a political will in China to invest big time in that energy. And so from being a leader, we were squeezed out of the market. And also all our other alternative energy, we had even a business line in our group. So it was oil, it was gas, it was alternative energy. So at the same level than the other two fossil fuels. But after 3 or 4 years, I think this was completely taken out because the market was not ready to pay for it. And there was no business model we could make work, the alternative energy front. So in solar, we were getting completely out. We stayed a little bit in biofuels in South America mainly because there it makes sense because there we have a lot of cars also running on ethanol. And we had some wind farms still in the US, which we still operate today. And so now in 2018, it's again more at the forefront, but it's completely seen now as a traditional investment. So it really needs, the business model needs to be there. And that's the difficult part because we depend a lot on regulation and there's no uniform regulation. So some countries push that alternative energy, some others push that, and that's kind of difficult then to really see where it's going to.
I think you even see that in the US. I think California's emission standards are different than the other states, and they're big enough that they can legislate it at least.
Yeah. So I think it's, and at our group level, I think we have, since the 2000s, we have said that climate change is an issue indeed, and that we need to do something. And not more recently than a couple of months ago, also our CEO has proclaimed the vision again, or not again, but still confirmed that we want to reduce the emissions out of our activities. So we have a lot of basic rules that apply. For example, I mean, we have never been in coal over the last years. That's the worst fossil fuel you can have, and which is still used big time, even in Europe. Although we in Europe talk a lot about the US, a really big polluter, but I mean, also here in Europe, we produce still a lot of our electrical energy out of coal, so which is not really good. So there's a shift in our group from oil to natural gas, which is already much less carbon intensive. And then we made also the pledge that although we want to grow, we don't want to increase our emissions. So it's really programs inside of the companies to foster and to make sure that our emissions out of the current portfolio is being reduced. And then also we invest mainly in portfolios and in energies where emissions also will be will be reduced. So it's but as said, it's a big challenge because of course also our industry is much dependent on the oil price, which is fluctuating sometimes quite a lot. There one could say also the US have introduced now a disruption again on the oil price with putting sanctions on Iran, which has now increased the oil price over the last couple of months by, has doubled it, or so to speak, which of course in the short term is true. In the midterm creates other opportunities to invest more money in finding new resources which are much more difficult to find or to exploit, which are the oil price of $30, which we had 3 years ago. I mean, that was a crisis in our industry. I mean, we had cost cutting, we had people being laid off in exploration, we closed a lot of production wells. And now we can start again, and also others can start again to develop a little bit more costly sources of energy. Which
reminds me of the tar sands in Canada.
Yeah, this is still quite out of the picture, even at these prices we have today. So that's, and there I think regulatory input is important also to maybe not make that possible anymore, like the tar sands, because if you make there a balance of the energy you put in and what you get out, I mean, that's it's really not sustainable and not really good to be done.
I'm going to throw any questions from the audience? Yes.
Nuclear fuel. Coal. This is broken in Germany. Want to close down on nuclear, go back to coal. Isn't that a great step? Disruption in a way as well.
Yeah, I think if you take the German example, I think there was also disruption that was Fukushima. Huh? Before Fukushima, Germany was still wanting to expand or at least keep all their nuclear fuel. But then due to that accident, they decided from one day to the other to stop all their nuclear fuels plants. And yeah, Germany, which is often seen at the outside as being on the forefront of renewable energy and being good for the climate, they had a big effort initiated 10 years ago to be at the forefront of alternative energies, but Germany is also the biggest producer of coal. So, on the other hand, that's contradictory, and it's really not good. And I think if all the coal plants in Germany would be fueled by, for example, natural gas, we would do quite a bit for the climate. But yeah, there's policy and not one clear vision, or not the same clear vision by all the countries is making it difficult. Or I remember after the Paris climate summit, I had a meeting with our minister, Mr. Bausch, who also put a lot of criticism against our industries and said, now even if the US have now ratified or are going to ratify the climate change protocol, so you are a dying industry. And then, yeah, came Mr. Trump, and then the picture was already on the political stage, completely different one again, also on that foot. So it's, I think if we want really to move in a good direction, I think the world needs to come up on the political level also, at least the big players, and there's the US, it's China, it's India, it's Europe. I think we need to move in one direction, else it's not going to work.
Yes.
I remember in 1974 I was cycling with my dad, and the reason I was cycling with my dad was that cars weren't allowed to drive in Germany because there was a shortage of fuel.
Yep.
Now that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
I just found it difficult to get my head around an entire industry not being able to solve the problem of being dependent on a source of energy that is final. Why is that? Why is this industry relying
Well, I'm not agreeing with that. I think it's going to last much longer, and that's probably the problem.
Half a century ago, there was, we knew that this would be final, and yes, it may last longer than we live, but one day it will be gone. And I think that there's no innovation.
Well, I think there's a lot of innovation there. I contradict you, and also on the on how long it's going to last. As I mentioned in the introduction, I think when I joined the industry, it was said 50 years. Indeed, there was still reserved for 50 years, but today it's still reserves that are exploitable for the next 50 years with a much higher consumption we have today. So, and with the technology that comes on board, I think this threshold is being pushed further and further. And I agree also with you that, yeah, there's not going to be, we cannot wait that again millions of years to that plants will be transformed into petrol again. So we'll probably use it up before, but I think I think it was Churchill who said the Stone Age did not end because there were no stones anymore. Same, the oil age will not end because there's no oil anymore, I think. But solving a problem, I mean, climate change is a fairly new problem that we realize, or we start to realize. So it's, and solving that by just not exploiting oil anymore, I think that's asking too much, because also all that we sit around here, we still want to have our mobility, we still want to have a heated room in the winter, an air-conditioned room in the summer, even more so probably in the future. So, and that's the challenge. I think it's cheap, oil, gas is also cheap, and the alternative energies that we portray these days, so wind, solar, they are not predictable. They cannot be stored yet in sufficient quantities at an economical cost or compared to oil or gas. If you imagine that if you go and fuel today a liter of gasoline or diesel at the retail side, you pay €1.20, €1.30. Half of that price is taxes. And that product is sold even with the taxes cheaper than this bottle of water, which is extracted 30 kilometers from here and just transported. It's not really transformed, but if you imagine all the transformations that are being done to a liter of petrol until it comes to a fuel pump and you can use it, it's tremendous. So it's a tremendous efficiency and the cost. Of course, you can argue, is the cost model right? Is all the environmental damage maybe figured in or factored in the price of a fuel? But that's politically, I think there needs to be changes that force then these costs to be included in there.
Mark, you want to add a point here?
I'm trying to get to your rescue because I think there are quite a number of parallels also with the healthcare industry and big industry, highly regulated industries. As I was joking earlier on about telemedicine, this is going to take another 10 years, 20 years. Everybody agrees that our healthcare systems are dysfunctional. We are very happy that they are working good, but I think if you look at the costs that we're spending for healthcare and the inefficiencies, they are plentiful. Why is nothing changing there? Also in the digital world, if you go, how much digital is in healthcare? There's not much, but we could do much, much more. Why is there no change? Well, because you have very big incumbents who have no bloody interest to change. The pharma companies, I used to work for a big pharma company. We had patents, and you would kind of like work with your generics and do everything to prolong your patent life. I think there were some elements like, oh yes, we know that we have to find new business models there, or that someday in the United States, notably, there will come regulation that you cannot charge $2,000 for 2 pills, but as long as we can charge them, let's spend on lobbyists and let's milk it. So I think and there's an interesting combination between regulatory, political, and if there is no pain point people will continue.
Or somebody else doing it. Somebody else coming up with a model and doing it differently.
But you cannot, and that's my point, you cannot disrupt the industry all alone, not by pure technology. You know, I think there have to be a couple of things which have to come together, where things, you know, like this is kind of like totally out of whack. And the example that you gave was very good. Like your disruption is basically a function of the oil price. If the oil price is high, it's like, oh, okay, let's milk it a little bit further. We can continue. If the oil price is low, it's like, oh, maybe we have to kind of like restructure and work on getting our money elsewhere. And you work on new technologies that for the day that it comes. But if the day that it comes is in 50 years or 100 years, well, we can still make a lot of profit until for the next 50 years. And that's the same mindset that you find in healthcare, that you find in other highly regulated, highly also distributed sectors, industries, where you don't have like one single decision maker. I mean, in healthcare, you have, it's probably the most complex area to be disrupted, because you have you have the patients, you have then the prescribers, you have the payers, who are all different people, you know. And when you ask me, anticipating your next question, when is it going to happen? If you look at the healthcare costs in the Western countries, they have been growing up year after year after year after year in terms of a percentage of GDP. Now, that's one graph, you know, just calling upon your imagination. It's like one graph going up. The next graph, you look at your age pyramid, and there you see that, what's going to happen in the next 50 years? You know, oh, there are more people who are getting older. Oh, and by the way, people are living longer. So at some point in time, the system is going to implode. And when is the system going to implode? Because at some point, the governments, they will no longer be able to say, oh, let's keep on financing and refinancing, because when you go to see a doctor, I mean, how much does the treatment cost when you get a new hip or when a certain treatment is done? You don't know, because somebody else is paying it. Until you have this visibility, you will see it. And this visibility will come because at some point in time, the governments, the social security will say, well, we pay up until this point, and this is going to be co-pay. And only when you start to kind of like become transparent what the co-pay is, then you as a patient will say, wait a minute, now I want to have some choice. And then you have the pressure that something in the system is going to change. So it's, and as long as it's going to take, well, let's make some more profit, and that's going to keep on continuing.
I have just a question. What do you mean by telemedicine? Is that like a video diagnosis, or because there you have huge legal problems, because we made a research on that. A doctor that will give you a diagnosis and you send him a small video, I think that will not fly. Yeah? It's a liability issue.
I took a picture of my tooth
Yeah.
and sent it to the
you
doctor.
can send it, but the doctor will. I mean, I did that once with a friend of mine, because I had an accident and I need surgery, and so I was in Spain and I had the flight the same day, so I sent a picture and then she said, okay, I will do the surgery, but she didn't do the diagnose. I went to see her. It's a people's business as well.
It will always.
I got the first version. It doesn't do that. I think I need an upgrade.
Need to disrupt it a little bit.
I know these devices are getting better and better and better over the generations, and I also know that these devices are being used in court cases. I mean, I think quite recent.
I think they're being used in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul at the moment.
Exactly. Well, that's a bit of a public comparison, but some murder cases are being solved, for example, because of the watch or and I think to myself, well, it's just a matter of time before courts will accept, well, yeah, your device has said that your heart rate is at a certain point in time is really high. It's because you're eating too many bad things or whatever. They can see, oh, you haven't been doing any exercise. So there again, insurance companies can also look at it in a way, you know, like, oh,
Yeah, but this is something else. I mean, here we speak about diagnose. You are a patient and you want the doctor to give you an advice, but you don't want to go to see him. And so you send a video. That's something different. Do you think you will find easily a doctor that says, okay, this is this, this, and that, without seeing you? I think he will take a huge risk, and I don't think he would be ready to do that.
I think the doctor would actually, okay, given
It's a
video
risk.
alone is not
If,
enough, but I can totally imagine the doctor would use the data from your phone, from your watch, that measures your heartbeat, etc., and based on that, do a diagnosis.
Well, the doctor will probably go to see his lawyer and ask about legal advice on this. And I would tell him, look, this is your risk assessment, but legally speaking, I mean, this is a risky thing because you have not seen the patient, etc. You have not really, for instance, I speak about skin cancer. You can have a tumor. If you have not really seen it and you see it just on a picture, it's not the same. I mean, it's a risk. And it's the doctor at the end of the day that will decide. But most of the people, especially like medical liability, etc., they don't want to go that way. And also, why would they do that? Because they sit there and the patient comes to them.
The solution is going to be that we don't need any doctors anymore because technology is going to solve it itself with artificial intelligence. I mean, you saw the perfect example here. And the doctors are really one of the problems in this liability element because the doctors, they don't know what to do with the data, but the data is there. You know, what is part of the problem? That the doctors, they are not sharing the data, and there are these, what I mentioned around these inefficiencies. And technology is going to push them and drive them to do things differently. And but it's not going to be, it's going to be a long process. You know, telemedicine, you know, I think telemedicine has, you know, I could have an entire lecture on it. It's like I'm sharing the data, I'm sitting in India and I'm looking at some pictures that's also called of telemedicine. There is a video consultation that I want to speak to my doctor and I see him and being reassured. I think there are many, many, many phases. You're not solving all of the problems with just one element. And I think there will be technological use. Same discussion about medical records. You know, I think there have been 2.7 billion in Germany, which have been spent in their medical record. In Luxembourg, we spent, I think, 50, 70 million on it for nothing. The French, the same. I mean, you try to solve very, very complex problems. Now, I have my medical record. I mean, I had, since one of my daughters had to go through an emergency surgery and I was traveling, and I got a call from the doctors like, well, what's your the vaccination card and this card and that card? And since that day, I have all of my medical exams in my mobile phone. Yeah. It's in my Dropbox, it's in my Evernote. Every time that I go to a doctor with my kids, I take a picture of everything. If anybody asks me a question, here it is. And, you know, to the legal questions, because there are also many lawyers involved there. The problem that we're talking about is a fake problem, or we going at it the wrong way. The Agence e-Santé is like, oh, how can one doctor share with the other some of the data? It's like, oh, have I given my patient consent? You know, if you're dying, you don't care about the patient consent, that's one thing. But on the other cases, it's we're complexifying an element. And the moment that it comes back to what I said earlier on, it comes back to the patient who is collecting the data on his smartphone, and the patient who said, well, here are all of my documents that every time that I went to a doctor, I insisted to have them, and you as doctor, here they are. You know, and it's the individual who's going to make it happen. It's not going to be a big system, regulatory system, because there are too many people who have interested, you know, to keep their profits flowing with the existing regulatory system. So you will have to bear with me for quite some time until we're getting to the full disruption here, but it will come.
Thanks. Thanks for the question and the different answers here too. We're going to end up with a final question here. So I'm going to throw it to. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
You know, Mr. Chairman, you know Buckminster Fuller?
Sorry?
Buckminster Fuller, you know who it is?
I'm sorry?
Buckminster Fuller?
Don't think so.
He's an American, he's a philosopher and also a wit. Anyway, King got a quote by him the other day. It said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model
That's a good one.
That sums it up, doesn't it?
I like that one a lot. I'll go back to the question I asked about. We mentioned Microsoft, Amazon, and some others. Uber is a great example. If the taxi industry wasn't so regulated, maybe Uber would have a fair fight. Apple. I think somebody mentioned Apple at the beginning. It's perceived as a disruptor, but when you said that, what were you thinking of a specific Apple product or not, or just in general?
Well, technically they change the way we perceive some electronics or user electronics by changing the user interface.
Right.
They focus is not on the device. The focus is on the content and the user interface. And that's what most of the industries, they try to change, giving you devices, new technology, it doesn't work. They disrupt the music industry, selling it a different way. Others were selling it a different way, but they did in another way, so they create an ecosystem. What they did with the App Store, there's an ecosystem with the App Store. So it's not just the device, it's the ecosystem, the content that goes with it. And that's why they're destructive. It's the first thing that I think it's Apple.
It's an interesting point. I'm going to ask each of the panelists that as the last question, but I think of Apple as having disrupted the camera industry, of all things, because they weren't first to market with phones or all the other thing, but they optimized it with the ecosystem, as you mentioned. But I have the new phone, and I have a camera, and I haven't needed my camera since I got the phone. And that's a massive disruption from what is essentially a communication device. So I'm going to start with Paul at the other end and end up with Veronique. So we started with ladies first and went up with ladies last. When you're looking at your businesses and potential disruptions, what keeps you awake at night? Is it existing competitors? Is it competitors you haven't thought of, or you're thinking of getting into the business, or regulators? What keeps you awake at night?
I think the most headaches we have are on implementing ideas, launching new projects, finishing new projects. In our industry, there are numerous ideas, numerous opportunities in the various areas on technology, on artificial intelligence, on marketing, because Apple is also a big marketing success, because that's, I think, the key to their success. And so there are numerous ideas, and for me, what struggles me most is to implement these ideas. So it's not the idea itself, it's implementation, to find the appropriate people, to find the appropriate funding, and to find the appropriate technology to make it happen.
Kind of like that old proverb, what is it, execution eats strategy for breakfast, or something like that?
Well, there are so many nice words now around with all is last. But that's really my biggest point, is to make it happen, because again, the ideas are plentiful and technology is there. It's just to make it happen.
So actually, to refer back to the question, your biggest worry is being able to execute on what you want to accomplish, rather than what somebody else is doing.
Again, the media industry, you can have a lot of ideas just by looking what other people do. Most of it applies also to Luxembourg, with some changes, of course. You have to apply to find the right ways to apply it to the multilingual, multi-diverse environment here in Luxembourg. But many things work. But again, here the challenge is to find the people, to find the funding to do it, because specifically you need to be very fast, and you need to be able to make a lot of things in parallel, and that's where basically I can't cope anymore. I have to do things in a sequence, and I can't do too many things together, or even in a sequence. That's the real bottleneck for the whole evolution.
Okay. Mark? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think you were very much disrupted last year by those two young people who started their own, let's say, information website.
Yes.
Here they're pretty successful. They crowdsourced their budget for
Yes.
the year. I hear a lot of people subscribing to their article. They only do these prime articles that you were referring, and they got rid of all the AP crap that we find everywhere. How do you address this?
Well, these two people were leaving my company to start their business, so I know them quite well, and I'm also a crowdfunder of theirs. Because I appreciate what they are doing, but that comes to what I said before when I said that everybody can nowadays start his own business, and they made exactly that based on a platform they could rent. And so they only had to build content, to build credibility, and to make the appropriate marketing. And for me, they are not a disruptor. They are an additional player in the industry, and a player with good intentions, if I may say so, with journalistic content, and with that in mind. And so I see our products and their product to be complementary, if I may say so, and not as a disruptor. Their model is new, and I hope they will have success. We were discussing their success with a friend this afternoon, and so I hope that they will have another success now when their first year is over and they have to renew these subscriptions from the Kickstart. And but I wouldn't agree. They are not, in my eyes, a disruptor. They are a good stimulation for the industry, for the media industry in Luxembourg.
They don't need advertisers, so their business model is very disruptive in this regard.
It's a new business model. Yes, it has existed, or it has been seen already in other countries. I mean, there's a Dutch model, the Correspondent, if I'm got the name right. So it's there are these media companies starting up, and I see that as a very good challenge for the old timers in the market. To think about their business and to think about their marketing, to think about their reason of existence. But again, I wouldn't agree to look at them as a disruptor.
If I may have on the last one, I think Mr. Molitor is the same path. If I say that sometimes we think that having an idea is 80% of the thing, but there's a lot of craftsmanship to go from the idea to the final product, and it takes time, and you have 3,000 things to think in the process, and things changing, and the more you advance and the more you think in some other things, and so I completely agree. It's not that easy to come from an idea to final product.
The idea is not even 20%. Oh, plenty. You know.
So if I can just lead back to the question, if you don't mind, you can address that as well. But so what keeps you up at night? Is it Luxembourgish receptionists, German doctors, or government healthcare systems?
German receptionists and Luxembourgish doctors. No, the other way around. What keeps me up at night? Probably how to grow faster. And probably, and I'm still working on growing faster with less resources, because I think we have a business model which works, but which requires a lot of upfront investment. When I'm talking to investors, institutional investors, I tell them that while we have to go and visit every single doctor, it's like, oh my goodness. Well, but why can't you just kind of like do a marketing campaign? And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, go out there. I mean, plenty of people have the ideas. You Google doctor, book an appointment with a doctor. Are you a doctor? Sign up here. Are you a patient? Sign up here. I can find you 50 sites in Europe who are doing that. And the 50 sites are crap because it doesn't work that way. And there is just one way primary way which works, which means that you have to visit every doctor. So we had to learn that the hard way. That's what is requiring a lot of money. And if I kind of like project how much money I will need to visit all the 500,000 doctors and get them on the platform, it's a hell of a money. So it's about how will I move faster, and how will I move quick enough, because at some point in time, other people will say like, oh my goodness, this is an interesting business. This is highly profitable, and hey, you have, all of the email addresses and phones and of the entire population. Because the difference between a job portal, you look for a job every 3, 4, 5 years, and then it's done. You look for a house every 5 years, unless you're in Luxembourg and you might want to make investments. So your touch point with these platforms is every several years. And the doctor, you see on average 8 to 9 times a year in our geographies. And you said, oh, no, I'm not going to see a doctor 8 to 9 times. Well, once or twice to see a dentist, once or twice to see a GP. Ladies, you go to see the gynecologist, you go see your eye doctor from time to time, and you have not even been sick.
That's a good point.
Okay, so I mean, look, this is public data. Look at the report of the Social Security. I think it's 7 or 8 times for Luxembourg. So which means that if you then have a product and a brand where you have a touch point where you touch the entire population, not just the people who are looking for something, and we are and will touch the entire population, and we touch the population on a regular basis, you can just briefly imagine how big of a brand this can be. So that's kind of like what keeps me up in mind. How can we make sure that we are this top of mind brand in digital healthcare?
That's an excellent point. Speaking of everybody in the population using your product, I think that's not a problem you have necessarily at the moment.
Not yet.
But what keeps you up at night?
Well, I think professionally speaking, it's certainly the regulations that are coming down the way, where I think that's my experience. That tells me I don't have the solution either. What's the best way forward? But I think trying to impose a solution is probably going to be the wrong one. I think I've a certain age now. I've seen over and over again that at a certain time of a decade, for example, everyone thought that's the solution, that's the way we should go, and then 10 years later we see, well, that has quite a lot of problems with it, and then we try to reverse again. If I take, for example, now the latest example of this, I would call it a diesel bashing, due to maybe a good ground that people are angry at some companies that fraud it. But if we want to, with the current technologies we have, solve the climate change problem, I think diesel is the fossil fuel that has the highest energy density. So it has the least CO2 emissions per kilometer driven. The electrical car, most of the time not yet, because most of the electricity is produced by coal. So, for example, but also the gasoline has not such a high density. So we have seen already in Luxembourg now that since last year the average CO2 emission for a new car has increased for the first time, because people are switching more and more to gasoline, which is much less efficient. And
you have to go to the gas station way more often.
Yeah, but that's not solving the other issue there, as I said. And
the law of unintended consequences.
And also, to make that point, when I started in the industry, gasoline was the bad product, because it was with benzene emissions, which is very cancerogenous. So that's why at that time gasoline was not a good product. And there I think politics also, they sometimes get on the wrong path, and if they regulate then wrongly, I mean, this is we have to pay all for that. So that's certainly the biggest worry. And I would wish also that at least in Europe we would have a unique direction we would go, because we are too small on the planet to make an impact if we, not at least as Europe, we go in the same direction. I mean, I think that's the biggest worry I have. And then maybe also, like Paul mentioned, finding the right resources here in Luxembourg, even to do projects, it's really a nightmare as well.
Veronique, you mentioned before about implementing IT strategy within your firm that reduced 15 lawyers sitting in a room with a bunch of documents to click, 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 3 minutes later, you have all the answers. Is that what's keeping you up at night, or is there something else?
No, yeah. First, if you look into the book "The Third Industrial Revolution" from Jeremy Rifkin, which most of you have maybe read because he did the report also on Luxembourg, he said that the last sectors that will be disrupted will be translation, and you see that when you use Google Translate because you cannot use that translation, and the legal sector because nobody is ready today also to be judged by a computer, for instance. So the judges will be the last ones that will. Maybe one day, but I think we are not ready. The legal sector is still people's business, and I think we are in the trend, and we want to stay in the trend because we try to find digital solutions, especially to be more efficient, and that's the link with the 15 junior lawyers, poor guys that sit 24 hours a day in a locked room. They will not disappear, but they will do more. A better work and also a bit more value for work. So they will not disappear, but they do other work. That's what it is. The legal sector is growing, and you said it. You are kept up at night because of the regulations and also all the different regulations in Europe. So our sector will be growing, and what keeps me awake is that while lawyers are not engineers, we know that. Normally lawyers are not mathematicians. And mathematicians are not good lawyers. So the problem is the legal, what we call legal engineers, is actually a lawyer that has to program. And that's very difficult to find. People that are good in law and at the same time have also an interest and a competence in programming computer programs. And that's, I think, very difficult to find in the future. And that's why also that's one of the reasons why this sector will not be easily disrupted, I think.
I'd like to thank all the panelists for a fascinating discussion tonight, and thank all of you for attending. And I believe there's drinks and canapes waiting for us outside. Thank you very much, and have a great evening.